Out with the old, in with the new. Everything you wanted to know about removing unwanted hair color.
You're going to need to remove old hair dye if your hair is simply too dark or you're changing from one color to another, like if you're red and you wanted to go brown. And anytime you want lighter hair that you've dyed before.
There are only two products that can remove unwanted hair color. The first is bleach, not household bleach, hair bleach. And the second is a hair color remover.
Permanent hair dye is made to lighten your natural hair color only. Have you ever noticed that when we try to dye our hair a new lighter color, only the roots take?
This happens because hair dye cannot make hair that has been dyed before lighter. Hair dye cannot make hair that has been dyed before lighter. Hair dye cannot make hair that has been dyed before lighter. Remember, when you use permanent hair dye, it has permanently changed your hair.
Think of what permanent means. If we were to tell you that you were going to be permanently rich, you'd be so stoked because that means you'd be rich forever. Remember, permanent means forever.
What we're going to focus on in this video is hair color removers. It is important to know that hair color removers, like color hoops, are only designed to remove permanent hair dye.
Using a hair color remover is the safest and most effective way to reverse a hair color that you don't like. When you're about to dye your hair using permanent dye, and you mix up the permanent dye and peroxide, those dye molecules start off really tiny. Now that peroxide helps open up your hair and allow those tiny little molecules inside your hair.
So as your hair dye starts cooking away, those molecules within the hair become bigger and bigger and bigger.
They get so big that they can't come back out the way they came in. And that is how hair dye stays.
So a hair color remover reverses this process. It takes those dye molecules and it shrinks them back down to the tiny size they once were.
This allows you to simply wash them away. Now it's important to know when using this type of product, you have to wash the heck out of your hair. Remember, all the product has done at this point is shrink those dye molecules. To remove them, that's actually your job.
If you have ever used one of these products or you know someone that has and they've complained their hair went back dark like it was before the hair color remover was put on, this happens because of one reason. You did not properly remove those tiny dye molecules.
As soon as you put a new hair dye on, that peroxide will re-fatten up those old dye molecules. And then you're right back where you started from. Really sucks. The good news is that hair color removers are so gentle on the hair that if this did happen, you can just use it again.
If you have ever dyed your hair using permanent hair dye, remember, your hair has been permanently changed forever.
If I was to remove this hair color, it would not go back to its original natural color. For example, if your hair is naturally brown and you used an ash blonde and it turned out blonde with a green tint and you used a hair color remover, it would remove the green tint, but your hair would remain blonde. Maybe not a pretty blonde, but blonde.
It is important to know you will have to dye your hair again. SalonFree always recommends using a semi-permanent or a demi-permanent hair dye over hair that has been treated with a hair color remover. We also recommend always choosing a hair dye that is 2 shades lighter than what you actually want it to go.
Because the hair has already been opened up before you apply that dye, hair dye can sometimes take a lot darker.
It's important to mention that just because you have removed your hair dye does not mean permanent hair dye can make your hair any lighter.
It won't. Remember, your hair has been permanently changed.
If after you have removed your old hair dye and you still want lighter hair, well, it's time to bring in the hair bleach.
Hair bleach will be the only thing that will lighten your hair. Wow, hair bleach is awesome. So to recap,
bleach and hair color removers are the only 2 products that can remove hair dye.
You need to remove the color if your color is too dark or you're just not happy.
After the hair color remover has done its job, now it's your turn. You have to rinse those tiny dye molecules out of your hair. It is your job to remove them. Don't expect your hair to return to its natural color if you have used permanent hair dye before. If after you have removed old hair dye and you still want it lighter, time to bring out the bleach.
And last but not least, choose a hair dye that's at least 2 shades lighter than what you actually want. After using a hair color remover, your hair's like a sponge. It's going to absorb that new dye really quick.
If you choose a lighter color, it will most likely end up the color that you want, and you won't have to worry about it going too dark. You just worked really hard on making your hair lighter. You don't want to do it again if you don't have to.